every player has been drafted, acquired, and signed, except for you, Swayman, for some reason, and you too, I guess. And now with the preseason underway, we're looking back through the entire offseason to see how every NHL team did and grading them from A+ all the way down to F to see how it'll affect them for this next year. But how well did your favorite team do this offseason? Did they do well? Did they do poorly against the rest of the league? Well, today we're going to be grading your team and the rest of the league here, so do not go anywhere. Make sure you watch till the end for every single pick and hit that subscribe button if you're new for more hockey content just like this all throughout the year, every single weekday. Now, to be completely honest with you guys, I was going to do this video after every single free agent signed, but I was a gullible boy thinking the Bruins would actually be able to sign Swayman. It ain't happening anytime soon. So screw it, I'm just going to make the video now and talk about this before the NHL season begins. I'm not going to let the Bruins ruin this, so let's get officially into it. Now, starting things out today, I have the Anaheim Ducks, and I think they had a relatively solid offseason. Nothing special, especially in free agency compared to other seasons, but they had a couple of decent moves, getting Brian Dumoulin for the defensive core, and Robbie Fabry, who, when healthy, has been solid. Last year, getting 18 goals, 32 points, hopefully is able to get to that 20-goal plateau for the first time in his career. I would love to see that, and hopefully having a fully healthy season in that bottom six for Anaheim. But to me, the big strength was the draft once again for the Ducks. I mean, you look at what they were able to get. You got Beckett Seneca, Stein Solberg in the first round, two very solid players, but also the depth outside of that. A skilled player in Lucas Pettersson, some really interesting play in Maxi Massey. I think a lot of potential in Terrence Smith as well. Some good picks overall, and a solid draft propels them to, I would say, a C+. It's a very respectable offseason for them. Now, going on to the Boston Bruins, starting with their draft, I think it was okay. You got Dean Letourneau as, I think, the only projectable piece long-term, but he should be a really interesting one as a future project and could become something really special. On the free agency side, you guys know how I feel about the Lindholm and Zadorov deals. Two contracts that I think are pretty healthily overpaid, especially in term. I think they'll be okay in their roles for now, but we'll have to wait and see how it projects. And then you, of course, have the infamous goalie situation where you trade Linus Ullmark to get Jonas Korpisalo. And the fact that they made this trade without even signing Jeremy Swayman, to me, has proved to be a massive mistake. And even now, even if he were to be signed tomorrow, I still think it would be a pretty big mistake at this point in training camp to have him come on to the team and have to make things work here. It's been a disaster in the goaltending side, and for that, it really propels it down the ranks to a straight D for me. Next up, we go on to the Buffalo Sabres, and they're going to get a pretty high grade, mostly because of their fantastic draft. Just in a lot of ways, had good value, getting Elias at 14, Kleber at 42nd is great, Brody Zemer in the 3rd round, but also players outside of that, like Luke Osborne, I really do like. Ryerson Linders, one of the best goalie prospects from that last draft, in my opinion, in the 7th round. A spectacular draft there, but I also did like what they went for this offseason, trying to become a team that's a lot harder to play against, getting Ryan McLeod for Matthew Savoy, which looked, I think, like a steal of the time for Edmonton, but I think McLeod could be really interesting in the Sabre system and could provide some good value as that 3rd-line center. You also see who they brought in Beck Mellenstein, Sam Lafferty into that bottom 6 too, and you just have a bottom 6 that's a lot harder to play against with the speed, with the physicality that all 3 of those players have. To me, I think that's pretty important, and to me, maybe the most important deal they made was bringing in Lindy Ruff as head coach. And you can say all that you want about him, but I think in terms of his first year impact, bringing the most out of offenses, I think he's going to do a lot for Buffalo and make them a super exciting team again, which I cannot wait to see. I'm going to give Buffalo a B+. For all these things put together, they're going to get the highest grade so far. Now we go into the Calgary Flames, who I think also did pretty decently. You, of course, have the Jacob Markstrom deal as the main trade from this offseason, and it was a big one. Trading Markstrom to the New Jersey Devils for a 1st-rounder, Ball as the main player back. I think the main priority, though, is just trading Markstrom so that Dustin Wolf can finally have the opportunity he deserves, and that, to me, was the main priority there, and Calgary was able to check that off. In free agency, you got Anthony Mantha, who was a decent ad, Ryan Lomberg for some depth, but really the main focus was, of course, the draft, where I think the Flames did really well. You got Zane Parekh, Matthew McGreen in the 1st round, Andrew Basha, Jacob Battaglia, Henry Muse, Kirill Zarubin. You also got players like Luke Misa as well in the 5th round, and I think all around, Calgary had one of the better drafts out of anyone there, and that to me was the most important thing to nail, and they did. So I think all things considered, I'm going to give them a B straight. Now we move on to the Carolina Hurricanes, and of course they had a good draft. I mean, Dominic Badinka, Nikita Artemadov in the 2nd round is just fantastic, but also Noel Franzen. You also got Justin Poirier in the 5th round. You got players like Fedor Avramov as well in the 6th. of course, Carolina continues to kill it. The rest of the offseason, though, is a weird one to me because you let go of Brett Pesce, of Brady Shea on the defense, you let go of Jay Guentzel, Teuvo Teravainen, a lot of different guys in free agency, and what you bring back, I think, is pretty pedestrian. Shane Gostisbehere, Sean Walker on the defense, I think 2 offensive D, but I think especially with the loss of Brady Shea, you shed a little bit of pure defense there. You also have Jack Roslovic, who is fine. He's decent, but I don't think is going to be a game changer for the Canes. I think they could have really changed this team up, really made it a lot better, but I think they decided to go more in the re-signing direction, focus on re-signing Jarvis, re-signing Marty Necas, and they, of course, were trying to trade Necas for a big part of that. That didn't end up happening. I think for Carolina, just overall, it was a pretty disappointing offseason, and I'm going to give them a D straight. It just was relatively underwhelming. Now going on to the Chicago Blackhawks, of course, the team that took Teravainen away from Carolina, and I think for Chicago, you got to start, of course, with the draft there, and a lot of people will say it was horrible because they skipped on Demidov for Levshunov, and I agree that I would have picked Demidov instead, but you could see the hole there for Chicago in terms of potential D, and Levshunov does fill that, and I don't think he would have been my pick, but I don't think it was an egregious, horrible pick whatsoever. He'll be solid for them. And you also got Sasha Boisvert, Merrick Vanacker in the first round as well, which I think are 2 solid picks there too. But you also got outside of that, John Mustard, especially AJ Spellisy, 72nd overall, which is looking really good for them. And overall, I would say they had a very good draft. And then you have the free agency additions, which I think were the best mix of veteran players with guys that can still perform for them now without sacrificing too much in the cap long term. A lot of these are shorter term deals, which I think is perfect for the Blackhawks. You got Tyler Bertuzzi, Teuvo Teravainen, Laurent Brossoit for the goaltending side, and on the defensive side too, TJ Brodie. And in Brodie's case, he's not his best right now, but you're bringing him on for the leadership, and I think it's a valuable thing to have for this young Chicago team. I'm going to give them a B+. Overall, they did quite solid here. Now, moving on to the Colorado Avalanche, their draft, I think, was actually pretty solid, especially goaltending-wise, getting Ilya Nabokov, Luka Klausier, also Ivan Yunin, some really good picks there, and I also really like Torrey Pittner as well in the 6th round there, too. Some solid picks here. They didn't do all too much in free agency, really just making a couple of defensive additions, getting Oliver Shillington and Eric Brandstrom. Brandstrom, especially, I think, is going to be fascinating for this team. He's already gotten some looks with Cale Makar, which would be incredible there. He's somebody that I think in the new system, especially with the way the Avs play, the puck possession, speeding, skating type style, Brandstrom I think could fit in pretty well there. So we'll see what happens. It's not an overwhelming offseason, but I think a C+ is pretty fitting. Advancing on towards the Columbus Blue Jackets, the main thing will of course be the draft for them. Kane Lindstrom at 4th overall, even if there has been some more injury troubles there, I still think will end up being a good pick. You got players like Charlie Elick, Evan Gardner, 60th overall, that are quite solid. Luca Morelli, Tanner Hendricks. Overall, a great draft for the Blue Jackets to build upon. You did get Sean Monahan, who I still think term-wise will be pretty rough for Columbus, but I don't think he does fit a hole for them. You do got the Patrick Laine deal, which I think in terms of value, there was no way they were going to really win that deal, but you did get Jordan Harris, who I think will be a pretty underrated ad for that defensive side, and you got James Van Riemsdyk also in free agency, who knows, maybe he provides some scoring there, but nothing that really moves the needle too much besides the hiring of Dean Evason, who I think is going to be pretty important to establishing some culture there. Overall, I think Columbus did well though, and I'm going to give them a B- here. Now on to my Dallas Stars, and I don't think they need to do anything extraordinary, but of course in the draft they got Emil Hemming, which I think at 29th overall is pretty fine value. Defensively, though, is where the big additions and subtractions happen, where they signed Ilya Lyubushkin, they signed Matt Dumba, who, to be fair, has looked okay in the preseason, but we'll have to wait and see on that. And goaltending-wise, they got Casey DeSmith, too, as a backup there to Ottinger, who I think will be solid there. But to me, the big thing was just a lack of potential. I don't think they needed to change the foregroup too much, but I really would have liked to see them re-sign Chris Tanev. That didn't end up happening, and I think it's going to sting. Sure, Lyubushkin and Dumba, they could be fine at best, but Tanev really kept that defense together, and losing him is going to be brutal. I'm just going to give them a straight C. I didn't have much expectations, so that makes it a little bit better. Now, starting out with Detroit, their draft definitely gets some good nods. Michael Brenzig-Newgard, I think, is going to be a fan favorite there in no time. Max Plant, Andre Becker, especially John Whipple in the 5th round, I think are going to be solid picks in no time, and just continues to add to Detroit's solid prospect pool. Free agency-wise, though, left my head scratching quite a bit. I did like bringing in Vladimir Tarasenko. I think he's going to be a lot of fun there, but you end up getting rid of a lot of depth in players like Daniel Sprong and players like David Perron and other players like Robbie Fabry. You could debate the actual value of these guys, especially in terms of health there, but I think Perron especially is going to be a pretty brutal blow. And defensively, your main ad was Eric Gustafsson, shedding Shane Gostisbehere, and I think you just got a worse offensive defenseman there. and you bring in Cam Talbot, who was solid in the first half for LA last year, but he's 37 years old, and I think having him as basically your starter coming into the season is a really big risk. We'll see how it works for Detroit, but I think they could have gone a lot more ambitious and kind of just fell flat for me. I'm going to give them a D+. Next up, we move on to the Edmonton Oilers, who made a lot of moves this offseason. Some of them were their choice, some of them were not. But of course, in the draft, you have Sam O'Reilly as their first pick, which I think at 32nd overall, he's going to be a ton of fun in that middle six someday as this grinding player, especially along the boards. Is going to provide a lot of value for the Oilers. But outside of that, you of course have the Ryan McLeod and Matthew Savoy trade. In free agency, they got Victor Arvidsson and Jeff Skinner, two guys who offensively, I think are going to bring a pretty big punch for the Oilers. But you also have, of course, the offer sheet situation where they have to let go both of Philip Broberg and Dylan Holloway. You, of course, have the Cody Ceci trade outside of that and bring in Vasily Podkolzin. But in that Cody Ceci trade, you got Ty Emberson, who I think is their most underrated addition. He's somebody that last year when he was healthy for San Jose, which wasn't too often, but he played 30 games and about defensively was outstanding for them. If he can continue that on to this Oilers defense, I think he could be a pretty good young addition for him, and I think could provide some good value. I'm going to give Edmonton a straight B. I think they did quite well, especially considering they had to deal with the offer sheet situation too. Now we're going on to Florida, who didn't really have the craziest offseason in the world, but winning the Stanley Cup is a pretty good excuse. The main thing for them was re-signing Sam Reinhart, which was a huge one, considering how valuable he was for them last year. 57 goals, 94 points, out of nowhere was just unbelievable. He'll stay a Panther for the foreseeable future, which is huge for them. Defensively, they did shed quite a bit, getting rid of Oliver Ekman-Larsson, other players too, but they did bring in Adam Boquist and Nate Schmidt, two guys who I think have a lot of prove in their own ways. In Schmidt's case, though, he's going to be brought back into Paul Maurice's system, and he got a lot out of him when he was there with Winnipeg, so maybe the same happens this time around. But for Florida, it was largely uneventful, but I'm going to give them a B- here. Now on to the LA Kings, and I think starting out in the draft, they did quite well, getting Liam Greentree at 26. I think it's just good value for what he could be, and Carter George at 57, I think is also quite good there too in the second round. And then you have their additions in the offseason, trading Pierre-Luc Dubois, which might be addition by subtraction, also getting Darcy Kemper, and if healthy, I think he could be solid for LA, especially considering how good he was when he did play there last time around. You also got the additions of Tanner Jeannot, Warren Fogle in the free agency period too, and I think honestly, they're digging into this hard to play against standard that they're trying to go for. We'll see how much it ends up working for them. I still think they have some issues in the top end scoring, but their depth has certainly taken a step up. So for that, I'm going to give LA a C+. Nothing incredible, but they did what they needed to. Now going on to the Minnesota Wild, to me, the highlight of their offseason was the draft. Getting, in my opinion, the best defenseman in the draft, Zeke Buem at 12th overall, an absolute steal. But outside of that, you got Ryder Ritchie in the second round, very solid value there at 45th overall. Aaron Kiviharu at 122nd, which is, you might as well just take that whenever you can. But it really is propelled by that because this is an excellent A+ draft. Outside of it, the big addition, I guess, was Yakov Trenin, who I like and I think is a good depth player, but that's it. And I think considering how underwhelming Minnesota was last year, unless Gustafsson is able to carry them again, I think you're going to have another disappointing season, and the lack of really anything in the offseason, I think will be a big reason for that. I'm going to give them a straight C. Just nothing incredible besides that draft. But now we're starting to get back into the good ones, and we're starting to get into the great ones. These next few are really solid, and we're starting out here with Montreal, and they let Kent Hughes cook again, and he had the opportunity. He seized it, especially in the draft. They had an excellent one, getting Ivan Demidov 5th, Michael Hage 21st, and then outside of that, Atos Koivu, which I think is the big one for them. Outside of that, there is some interesting projects, but we'll have to wait and see on those, but the top of the draft is as good as you could really get. But outside of that, the Patrick Laine deal was, of course, the big one, giving away Jordan Harris. To me, I think this really completes their top six. I don't even know if they needed to get Laine, considering they already got Demidov and Hage in the draft, but this really makes Montreal's forward group a lot more scary for the future. If he's able to turn that page, if he's able to become the goal scorer that we know he can be, he is going to be so valuable for this Habs team. I'm going to give the Habs a straight A. They did about as good as they could have. Maybe another big addition could have been warranted, but I think for the Habs, they did just fine here. Now on to Nashville, another team that was really active in this offseason. They started out in the draft, and I think they did really well, getting Igor Sherin at 22nd, and Teddy Stiga, especially at 55. I think we're going to look back on that one and wonder how he dropped that far, because it's just ridiculous that he did. And then we, of course, go to what they did in free agency, where the Preds went big game hunting, signing Steven Stamkos, Jonathan Marchessault onto the foregroup, defensively getting Brady Shea, and on the goaltending side, getting Scott Wedgwood, who I think is a little bit of a downgrade from Lankinen, but not by too much. But Nashville, I mean, they went out and did everything they possibly could, and you got to give them respects for that. An A+, maybe at a slight overpayment in the cases of Brady Shea, but I think he'll be good for them on that defense, and I think considering how barren their defense was, they needed that type of presence. Now we go on to another great offseason. This time we're going on to the New Jersey Devils, who started out well in the draft, getting Anton Slyev 10th overall. Mikhail in the second was good. I also like their third round too, getting Reinhart and especially Herman Trapp at 91. Some solid picks overall. Then you of course have all the additions they made, getting Sheldon Keefe, who I think especially regular season wise is going to propel them by a bit. But you got the big addition in Jacob Markstrom, who to me was necessary. New Jersey needed to add a starter, and they got one of the best ones out there, especially for the Devils short term. I think he's going to be exactly what the doctor ordered. But you also got Brett Pesce, Brendan Dillon out of that defense, so I think they're going to be two solid D, especially in Dillon's case. I think he's going to be also exactly what New Jersey needs. But the foregroup too, you bring in Tomas Tatar, Stefan Nosen especially, I think bringing him back is going to be a lot of fun. He's improved a lot over these last couple of years, and as a depth piece, he's going to be perfect, bringing some physicality that New Jersey needs. You can sense the trend here. A lot of these additions are holes that New Jersey filled perfectly, and for that, I couldn't really get much better than it. I'm getting them an A+. They deserve it. Now, this take might actually get me some heat because I don't think a lot of people are brave enough to say this, but I actually think the Islanders had a decent offseason. Obviously, they didn't do too much outside of the draft, but I thought that draft was pretty spectacular. They get a top end forward here in Cole Eisman, which I think was necessary. But outside of that, Jesse Pulkkinen brings some pace. Camille Bednarik, I think, is going to be a solid bottom six center in the NHL someday. You also got the goaltending pair in Dmitry Gazman and Marcus Gidloff, two guys who could have NHL potential. Obviously, outside of that, it's not much. Really, the only one was Anthony Duclair, but also I like the Duclair signing. I think he's going to bring some speed that New York needs. He's going to bring some good intensity there on the puck, and it wasn't breathtaking. It's not the rebuild that I want to see New York go in, but for what they're in positionally, I think they did just fine. I'm going to give them a C+. I guess Lou kind of cooked a little bit. Now on to the New York Rangers, and this was really the offseason and missed potential to me. Their draft was solid. I think H.J. Emery at 30th overall is going to be a very competent pick for them, and a guy that will factor into that defense pretty strongly in the future. But in free agency, they got Riley Smith. They also traded Barclay Goodrow's contract, which I think is pretty good for them. But they could have done so much more. I mean, Riley Smith is a good player, but I don't think he's going to really drastically improve their 5-on-5 play, which I think was a big weakness for them. They also get Sam Carrick, but they failed to trade Jacob Trouba, and that was a whole disaster throughout the offseason, his negotiations with them. And I just feel like the Rangers could have done a lot more here to get a lot better, but just a lot of missed opportunity here to shed cap, to bring in players that just ultimately didn't end up happening. And the fact they haven't signed Igor Shesterkin yet either is making things a lot more complicated than it needs to be. Yeah, I didn't really love their offseason. I'm going to give it a C- here and not much more. Now we go into the Ottawa Senators, who I think had a really solid, really good offseason. You guys know how I feel about their draft, but I think Carter Yakimchuk will still be a solid player for them offensively. I think Blake Montgomery as well is a good pick there too. But they were quite active outside the draft, trading for Linus Ullmark, which is going to be the real valuable piece here. Whether they make the playoffs is still in question, but I think Ullmark is going to really improve their regular season totals just for being a competent goaltender finally for the Sens. Outside of that, you of course traded Jacob Chychrun for Nick Jensen, who I think short term could add maybe some defensive play there. And the forward additions I think were good. David Perron I think is going to be a really valuable veteran piece. You also got Michael Amadio, who I think is an underrated addition as well. And besides Ullmark, it was nothing spectacular, but some solid deals all around that will make them better in the future. And I think for Ottawa, that's all they really needed. Oh yeah, for the Sens, I forgot to say it, but I'm going to give them a straight B. Their draft kind of disappoints me a little bit, but the offseason additions outside of that make up for it. Now we go into Philadelphia, who had a really uneventful offseason, I would say, in terms of actual additions. Really nothing there, but the draft was okay, I would say. A lot of people overhated on the Jet Luchenko pick, but I think he's going to turn out to be a very solid center for them. Of course, the big one was signing Matvei Michkov, bringing him over to North America for his development. I think is going to be absolutely huge for him long term. Outside of that, you re-sign players like Travis Konechny, Bobby Brink. it was okay, but nothing all too crazy besides the Michkov signing, and I'm going to give them a C+ here. Now moving on to the Pittsburgh Penguins, who are a weird team to talk about and actually make a grade for, because I think they did okay overall, but it was like the Rangers, where the lack of reaching their potential brings it down for me. Draft-wise, I think they did okay with their first couple picks. Harrison Brunicky, with the solid skating there, could turn out to be a really solid player, 44th overall, and Tanner Howe at 46, I think is also just good value there too. Of course, the big move was getting Rucker McGrody for Braden Yeager, who I think they got the best prospect out of that deal, so that is a win for them. But you look at the other additions they made, and players like Kevin Hayes, Cody Glass, Anthony Bavillier, I mean, Blake Lizotte could be solid for them, but I just look at the defense. Matt Grzelcyk, I mean, it's just a lot of moves that maybe bolster the depth a little bit, but I think they're players that are going to largely be forgettable additions in the end. Not strong depth, but just additions to make additions. We'll see if it works out for Pittsburgh, but I'm not betting on it. And for that, I think I'm going to give them a straight C. The McGrody and draft, though, does propel it for me. Next up, we move on to the San Jose Sharks, and honestly, maybe the best offseason out of the bunch is San Jose. You look at their draft, and I think they crushed it. Macklin Celebrini, Sam Dickinson, 11th overall. That's just perfect. Then you go in the second round, Igor Chernyshov, Leo Solano Elias, especially Chernyshov at 33rd overall. Absolute steal there. But I also love Carson Wetch as well at 82. You got Colton Roberts as well for some defensive depth in the future. A fantastic draft to start things out. And outside of that, you had a lot of key critical additions, players as well that will be veterans and good, useful players around players like Celebrini and Smith and Eklund. Tyler Toffoli will bring some scoring for them. Alexander Wenberg, I think, is going to be pretty valuable. But you also got players like Ty Dellandrea, and on the defense, they stole Jake Wallman from the Red Wings. They also got Cody Ceci as well for some depth. But the big one is Yaroslav Askarov shoring up that goaltending for the future. They needed a young star goaltender. That was really the big key piece missing, even after the 2024 draft, and they got it in Askarov. Exactly what the Sharks need to do with the draft, with free agency, with their trades. And to me, they get an A+, and just like Nashville, deservedly so. Now going straight on to Seattle, and they did a really interesting job here, especially in the draft. They go out for another center, getting Berkeley Catton going for best player available, and at 8th overall, hard to disagree with that. But outside of that, they got Ole Joseph in the 4th round, Kim Sarayan in the 3rd, and some good picks all around here. Free agency-wise, you of course had the big additions in Chandler Stevenson and Brandon Montour, and just like the Bruins pair of free agent deals, you guys know how I feel about the contracts. I mean, term-wise, these could be really big problems for the Seattle Kraken in the future. But for the now, I think they will improve the team. By how much will be the big question there. But I think for the Kraken, they got better, and especially with the re-signings they made in Larson and especially Matty Beniers, those are pretty critical for the Kraken. I'm going to give them a C+. I think the free agency additions kind of put it down for me long term, but it is what it is. Seattle's in this weird win now mode, I guess, even though it felt like they were kind of transitioning back to a retool. We'll see how it works out for Seattle if they're able to actually make the playoffs once again. Next up, we're going to the St. Louis Blues, who, if I had to describe, just had a funky offseason. Their draft was really bringing out a lot of strong players into their pool in Adam Jiricek, Lucas Fisher, Adam Yakov, a lot of big boys into the group, which is pretty fun to see. But of course, the big splashes were the offer sheet. St. Louis making a big splash here, offer sheeting both Philip Broberg and Dylan Holloway from the Edmonton Oilers, and this was just a ton of fun to see. I love seeing offer sheets, but for the Blues, it made a ton of sense for them to bring on these younger presences. They needed to get a lot younger, especially with the depth there, and I think Broberg and Holloway are going to bring that. It wasn't a crazy offseason, and they make too much changes, but I think the changes they did make were pretty good, and a solid draft puts them up to a B- for me. Now moving on to the Tampa Bay Lightning, this was really an offseason of loss and trying to gain from it. They lost Steven Stamkos to free agency, but they brought in Jay Guentzel. I still think that'll have a lingering effects towards the actual franchise and the leadership there, but Guentzel, of course, bringing in a younger piece there could prove to be influential there. You also have the huge Mikhail Sergachev trade, trading him to Utah, getting Connor Geeky, JJ Moser back. Moser, I think, could be pretty solid on that bottom pair if he's ending up there with Tampa. You also got Ryan McDonough back from Nashville. After trading him to Nashville just a couple of years ago, he's still playing pretty well, though, at 35 years old. I think could still be pretty valuable on that middle pair, perhaps. We'll see what Tampa ends up doing, but I think they were in a weird transitional period, losing a lot, but trying to gain as much as possible, and I think they did okay in that situation. So for that, I'm going to give them a C+. Now going on to the Toronto Maple Leafs, who I think had a pretty pretty underrated offseason, all things considered. Defensively, they added Chris Tanev, Oliver Ekman-Larsson, 2 additions who, although they're on the older side, I think right now will be pretty critical to their defense going forward. I think they lost a little bit of a step these last couple of years, and I think getting these two guys, especially Tanev, is huge for them. And also Anthony Stolarz as a backup, I think will be pretty good in that role for the Leafs. But of course, the big, massive deal was getting Craig Berube as head coach, and I think he's going to make a world of difference there with the intensity that the Leafs put out. Berube is going to be a big part of that, and all things considered, I'm going to give the Leafs a B+. And every single position, I think they got better here, and I think that's huge for the defense and huge for the coaching style. That's going to be a big change, especially towards the playoffs. Now we go into the Utah Hockey Club with their first ever offseason, and boy did they make a splash. I mean, you look at the draft, and they drafted just a ton of big boys, and T.J. Ginla, Cole Baudouin, but Will Skahan, and players like Gregor Beber, and just a lot of big presences, especially on the defensive side there too, but a solid draft all around. But the big weakness that Utah needed to correct was the defense, and boy howdy did they, getting Mikhail, Sergachev, John Marino, Ian Cole, some great, really just a mix of a top end D, a middle pair D, and a bottom pair D, and I think for Utah, it completely changes this team. The forward group is already fantastic, and if Connor Ingram can replicate a season from last year, again, I think Utah is a playoff team coming up. I think you're going to surprise a lot of people, and for that, I'm going to give them a straight A. Solid draft, great trade period. They did exactly what they needed to here. Now on to the Vancouver Canucks, who it felt like pretty much exchanged players with the Boston Bruins. Bruins got Lindholm, they got Zadorov. The Canucks got Jake DeBrusk, Danton Heinen. They also got Derek Forbort as well. We also got Vincent Desharnais, who's fine. Daniel Sprong, who's showing some highlight reel plays already. But to me, Jake DeBrusk was really the main prize here. He, to me, I think is going to be fantastic in that top 6. He's going to be perfect with a player like Elias Pettersson. We'll see how they end up gelling, but I think those two are going to be brilliant there. And overall, I think for the Canucks, they did about as good as they could have, considering how many UFAs are going to end up leaving. They recouped a lot of their lost assets, I think, pretty well here. And for one of the first times, I think, in this channel's history, I actually enjoy what Vancouver's done this offseason. I'm going to give them a straight B. They deserve a pat on the back for this one. Now going on to the Vegas Golden Knights, and definitely one of the more disappointing offseasons for me. They had an okay draft, I would say, and a decent one, getting Trevor Connolly 19th overall. You also got Pavel Moisevich as well, who I think is going to be a pretty big impact goalie for them in their prospect pool. But outside of that, they just lost a lot in players like Jonathan Marchessault, Michael Amadio, William Carrier, Logan Thompson. Just a lot of pieces that I think were important to them, and especially the wing depth has taken a big step back. They're relying now on players like Alexander Holtz and Victor Olofsson to carry their offense, and they might offensively do well, but there's some big holes there defensively there now, and you also lose Logan Thompson on the goaltending side, and I don't know, man, just a lot of losses for Vegas that I think are going to pile up throughout the season and really make themselves known. And I think for Vegas, I'm going to give them the lowest score out of the group. I'm giving them a D- here. Now going on to the Washington Capitals, and I think they did very well here. Their draft was competent, but really the additions they made, you could say what you want about Pierre-Luc Dubois, but I just have a funny feeling that he's going to end up working out in Washington, but we'll have to wait and see what happens there. But you also got Andrew Mangiapane, who I think is going to bring some good speed to the lineup. And defensively, both Jacob Chychrun and Matt Roy make the defense a little bit younger, and I think both of those guys will be very solid for them too. You also got Logan Thompson, who I think is going to be a perfect player to bring on. And right behind Charlie Lindgren, those two guys are going to be cooking together, I feel like. And just all around, some good additions in every single position. And for the Caps, I think they just got better. And I think even though they lucked their way into the playoffs last year, if they were to make the playoffs this next season, I think it'd be a lot more understandable. Now, it's kind of a sour and underwhelming point to end off with, but we have the Winnipeg Jets here as the last team to talk about. Really, the big move they made was losing the Rucker McGrody deal, which they didn't really have much momentum. I totally understand that. And honestly, I think getting Braden Yeager is still a pretty good compromise, but it's not Rucker McGrody. I think there's a difference between the two players. Outside of that, they brought in Colin Miller for the defense, Capo Kakinen as a backup, who's pretty decent, but you can make the case that Winnipeg didn't need to make all these crazy moves. They already have their core pretty locked into place, but they didn't really change too much in the formula. I'm going to give them a D+. It just is what it is. It was an okay offseason. They didn't do much. What do you want from me? But those are my grades for the 2024 NHL offseason for every team. And if you guys did enjoy, make sure you hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell. Comment down below your thoughts on my grades. What would you give your favorite team? And I would love to hear your thoughts down below on all those other teams as well. Of course, you're available for hockey fans you guys know online. And make sure you click on this card for all of my hockey rankings right in one playlist. But of course, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already. And I will see you guys in the next one. I hope you have a fantastic hockey day. And goodbye.